The rescue center sat on the outskirts of Fort Collins, Colorado, where the fields stretched wide under the summer night sky. It wasn't a large facility, just weathered barns, wooden fences, and a few lanterns glowing faintly in the dark. Inside one of those barns, something no one could have expected was taking place. In the corner stall, a lion cub had his paws wrapped tightly around a small gray kitten. The kitten trembled, letting out sharp, uneven cries, but the cub only pressed closer, holding him as if he could keep the pain away. James Carter, the caretaker, stopped in the doorway, stunned by the sight. In all his years working with animals, he had never seen anything like it. James, a man in his 40s with strong shoulders and weathered hands, knew the signs of play, fear, or dominance in young predators. This wasn't any of those. The cub wasn't wrestling or biting, he was hugging. Every time the kitten cried out, the cub pushed his nose against the tiny body, nuzzling with a gentleness that felt almost human. The kitten's fur was damp, his body shaking as though from fever or pain. James crouched, trying to see if there were wounds, but the cub shifted immediately, blocking his view. The look in the cub's amber eyes stopped James in his tracks. It wasn't fear, it was warning, a silent message. Don't take him from me. James's heart pounded. He had raised cubs before, seen them cling to siblings, but never protect another species. His voice came out in a whisper, barely audible over the kitten's cries. Why are you doing this? The words felt strange, hanging in the still barn air, unanswered. The kitten let out another weak mew, muffled against the cub's chest. The sound wasn't hunger, it was raw, as if each breath carried hurt. Still, the cub held firm, tiny body, acting like a shield. James realized he couldn't intervene without breaking the fragile bond forming right before his eyes. Stepping back, James felt the weight of the moment pressing in. He thought of other rescues at the center dogs, nursing raccoons, goats calming foals, but this was different. This wasn't play or accident. The cub wasn't curious. He was guarding, almost desperately. A thought flickered in James's mind, unsettling and impossible to ignore. What if the cub knows something we don't? His gut told him this was more than instinct. Tomorrow, the veterinarians would have to look deeper. Night, though, James could only watch as the lion cub cradled the kitten, refusing to let him go. The next morning, sunlight spilled through the thin windows of the barn, painting the straw in golden streaks. The cries of the kitten had softened during the night, but he still lay pressed against the lion cub's chest, too weak to move. When the veterinarians arrived, called in urgently by James, they expected the usual: a wounded stray, a routine check. But the moment they stepped inside and saw the cub clinging to the tiny body, their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. "I've never seen anything like this," one of them murmured, shaking her head as if unsure whether to step closer or keep her distance. Dr. Emily Foster, a young vet with sharp eyes and a steady hand, knelt first. She was used to unpredictable behaviors in wild rescues, but this was different. Every time she leaned in, the cub growled softly, not in aggression, but in warning, like a guardian standing watch. Emily glanced back at James, her voice low. "It's not play." "He's protecting him." James nodded slowly, his arms crossed, still shaken from what he had witnessed overnight. He had barely slept, haunted by the sound of the kitten's cries. The team decided to try gently separating the animals, at least for an examination. James crouched beside the cub, speaking softly, "It's okay, little guy. Let us help him." But the cub refused, pressing his paws tighter around the kitten, his tiny claws digging into the straw as if anchoring himself there. Emily reached forward with careful precision, but the cub hissed, startling everyone. It wasn't the roar of a predator, but the desperate plea of a friend unwilling to let go. The air in the barn grew thick with tension. Finally, James placed his hand firmly on the cub's back, steady but kind, murmuring words of reassurance. The cub's eyes locked on his, full of fear and defiance. For a moment, it felt like a standoff between man and beast, even though the cub was barely bigger than a household dog. Then, slowly, hesitantly, the cub loosened his grip just enough for the vets to slide the kitten into a soft blanket. The cub whined in protest, pawing at the air as the tiny body was lifted away. On the examination table, under the bright lamp, the kitten's frailty became undeniable. His ribs showed through his thin fur, his breathing shallow, each inhale sounding strained. Emily's brow furrowed as she listened to his heartbeat with her stethoscope. "Something's not right," she said, her voice firm now. This isn't just malnutrition or stress, he's in pain." The room fell silent except for the faint rustle of the kitten shifting weakly against the blanket. James felt his stomach tighten. His instincts had told him the night before that this wasn't ordinary, and now the evidence was right in front of them. As the vets worked, the cub paced in the stall, restless and vocal. He pressed against the wooden gate, his tiny roars echoing in protest, each sound sharp with urgency. James stood nearby, torn between sympathy and unease. How could such a young predator be so attuned to the suffering of another creature? Emily glanced at the cub and whispered, almost to herself, "It's like he knew before we did." Those words hung in the air, heavy, as if no one wanted to admit how impossible they sounded. When they attempted to draw blood, the kitten cried out louder, and instantly the cub threw himself against the gate, nearly toppling it. The vets froze, startled by the force of his reaction. James rushed to steady the barrier, his heart pounding. The cub's eyes burned with desperation, his tiny body trembling with each frustrated roar. "He can feel it," James said, his voice cracking. "He knows the little one is hurting." For a brief moment, even the experienced vets were speechless, watching an instinct they couldn't explain unfold before them. As the tests began to reveal troubling signs, elevated heart rate, difficulty breathing, and indications of something deeper, the room carried an unspoken truth. The kitten was not simply weak. Something inside was failing him. And through it all, the lion cub refused to calm, pressing his face through the bars, reaching as if his presence alone could ease the pain. James watched, caught between awe and dread, realizing that whatever they discovered next would not only explain the kitten's cries, it would also prove that the cub had sensed it all along. The results came back slower than anyone wished. James leaned against the wooden beam near the stall, arms crossed tight, while the veterinarians whispered among themselves over charts and screens. The cub never stopped pacing, his paws dragging lines into the straw. Every time the kitten whimpered from the table, the cub answered with a restless cry, a rhythm of distress that no one could ignore. It was as if the two creatures were connected by a thread invisible to human eyes. The vets exchanged looks, and James felt his chest tighten, bracing himself for news he didn't want to hear. Dr. Emily finally turned toward him, her expression firm but shaded with sadness. "It's more than weakness," she said, placing a gentle hand on the kitten's frail body. "His lungs are struggling. There's fluid building where it shouldn't be. We suspect congenital heart issues, maybe even something we can't repair fully." Her words landed heavy in the barn, echoing louder than the kitten's cries. James swallowed hard, his throat dry, while behind him the cub let out a low, mournful sound, as if the words had reached him too. The kitten's tiny chest rose and fell in uneven patterns, every breath a battle. Emily stroked his fur, her voice soft but steady. "He must have been in pain for days, maybe weeks. And yet, somehow, this cub never left him." She glanced toward the stall, where the lion cub pressed his face against the wooden slats, amber eyes locked on the table. The sight made her pause, her professional detachment slipping for a moment. "It's almost like he's been keeping him alive with comfort." James's jaw tightened, unsure whether to nod or shake his head. He couldn't deny what they were all seeing. One of the other vets, older and more skeptical, muttered under his breath, "Animals don't think like that." But even as he said it, the cub let out another heartbroken cry, timed perfectly with the kitten's weak whimper. The sound silenced the room. No one spoke again. The older vet turned away, unwilling to meet the eyes of the others, as though admitting the truth would break something he had built his career on. James caught Emily's gaze, and for the first time, he saw her eyes glisten. They tried giving the kitten oxygen, placing a tiny mask over his face. At once, the cub quieted slightly, his restless pacing slowing as though he could sense relief. James noted the change with a shiver down his spine. "He feels everything," he whispered. The others nodded silently. No textbook had prepared them for this. No lecture or research paper had described a bond so fierce, so unexplainable. The barn was filled with the hiss of oxygen, the steady hands of the vets, and the ever-watchful presence of a lion cub who refused to look away. For a brief moment, the kitten seemed to relax. His body, once stiff with pain, loosened against the soft towel beneath him. Emily adjusted the oxygen flow, her movements careful, controlled. "We can stabilize him for now," she said, her voice calm, though her eyes betrayed the weight of the situation. James let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding, but the relief was fragile, fragile as glass. They all knew it wasn't a cure, it was borrowed time. And yet, in that fragile reprieve, the cub pressed himself harder against the stall gate, stretching his paw through the narrow gap as far as it could reach. The gesture was simple, instinctive, but it carried more emotion than words ever could. The kitten, eyes half shut, seemed to turn his head toward that touch, as though finding strength in it. James felt the back of his throat burn, witnessing a connection that defied everything he thought he knew about nature. The barn was quiet except for the kitten's faint breathing and the occasional cry from the cub. The vets worked silently, their focus sharp, but their eyes often drifting toward the unlikely guardian pacing just feet away. They could ease the symptoms, they could buy time, but the reality hung over them like a storm. This kitten's life was measured in fragile moments. And in those moments, the lion cub stood as his protector, a silent witness to pain and resilience, teaching everyone in that barn that compassion has no boundaries. As the hours passed, the barn became a place suspended in time. The veterinarians worked in shifts, adjusting the kitten's oxygen, monitoring his tiny heartbeat, and recording every fragile sign of progress. Yet no matter who stepped forward, the cub remained rooted at the stall gate, eyes fixed, body tense. He refused food, refused rest, as though his only purpose in that moment was to keep vigil. James stayed close as well, drawn into the weight of the scene, unable to walk away. It was no longer just a medical case, it was a story unfolding in front of them, one that reached into the human heart as much as it did into science. By late afternoon, the kitten's breathing steadied slightly, though his strength remained dangerously low. Emily stood over him, carefully adjusting the blanket, and said softly, "We're not out of the woods, but he's still fighting." She turned her head, catching sight of the cub pressing his paw through the wooden bars again. The sight pulled something deep inside her, as she whispered to James, "He won't give up on him, so neither will we." James nodded, his weathered face set with determination. The bond between the two animals was fueling the resolve of the entire team. At last, Emily suggested something unusual. "Let's bring him closer," she said, motioning toward the cub. There was hesitation, but finally James lifted the kitten gently, oxygen tube and all, and carried him back toward the stall. The cub's body quivered with anticipation, tiny roars spilling from his throat. When James lowered the kitten near him, the cub immediately pressed his face against the frail body, humming a low vibration, half growl, half purr. To everyone's astonishment, the kitten's breathing calmed, his cries softening into silence. It was as if being held in that embrace gave him the strength machines alone could not provide. The vets exchanged glances, their disbelief dissolving into something closer to reverence. Science could explain stabilizers and medication, but not the way the cub's presence soothed pain. Emily leaned back against the wooden wall, her eyes wet. "It's more than instinct," she murmured. "It's love." The words hung in the air, undeniable, and no one challenged them this time. James swallowed hard, his chest swelling with the raw truth of what he was seeing. In that moment, the wild and the domestic, predator and prey, had vanished. There was only one fragile life and one determined guardian. As evening fell, the team knew the road ahead was uncertain. The kitten's condition would require ongoing care, maybe surgery, maybe long-term treatment. Yet one thing was clear, he was not alone in the fight. James looked at the cub, still holding the kitten close, and saw something pure, a reflection of the bond humans often forget they share with the creatures of the earth. He thought of all the times he had seen cruelty, neglect, abandonment, and realized this image was the answer to them all. Even a lion cub could show compassion greater than fear. Before the vets left for the night, they gave the kitten medication to ease his breathing further. James stayed behind, sitting on a stool in the dim barn, watching the two small bodies pressed together in the straw. The cub licked the kitten's head with slow, deliberate care, as if sealing a promise. James felt the sting of tears in his eyes but didn't look away. He wanted to remember every detail, the sound of the cub's breath, the way the kitten's tiny paw twitched in response, the peace that finally settled into the air. When the lantern light flickered low, James whispered softly into the quiet, "You've saved him." The words weren't meant for the vets, or even for himself. They were meant for the cub, who lifted his head and stared back with eyes that seemed far older than his age. James felt a shiver run through him, not from fear, but from awe. The cub returned his head to the kitten's side, curling his body protectively around him. It was a gesture no human could misinterpret. It was love in its purest, simplest form. And so, the night closed with a scene no one would forget. A lion cub cradling a fragile kitten. Their breathing in sync, their bond undeniable. The vets had given medicine, machines had offered oxygen, but it was the cub's embrace that carried the most power. In that barn on the outskirts of Colorado, everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something extraordinary, proof that compassion crosses species, sizes, and even the boundaries between wild and tame. And as James finally dimmed the lantern, leaving the two nestled together, he whispered the thought in his heart: if he can care this much, so can we.